Welcome back. This is Chapter 10 of the Garrison text for our managerial accounting course. And here we're talking about the standard costs and overhead analysis, so kind of variance analysis as applied to manufacturing operations. So what are standard costs? Well, standard costs are normal kind of expectation for the cost of direct materials and direct labor in particular for use in production. And in general, standard costs would be developed so that you have some idea of what it should cost to make a particular product. So there are two parts of a standard cost. One is the quantity, so the quantity of raw materials or the quantity of labor hours that it takes to produce a standard unit. And then there's a cost or a price standard, which says how much should be paid for each unit of labor and each unit of materials. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to identify exceptions that are worth doing something to adjust. So management by exception is the term that we're looking for. So we want to identify differences from expectations which are significant enough that they require management to make some kind of intervention. And so direct labor, direct materials, and manufacturing overhead are graphed here, and we can see that there's kind of a standard level of costs, and if the costs are over the expectation or over the standard, we would need to do something. So in this case, direct labor and manufacturing overhead are both below the standard expectation, but direct material is substantially higher. So we don't really need to do anything about direct labor and manufacturing overhead because they're consistent with our expectations, but the direct material number would be something that we'd want to look into. And that could be either because we use too much material or because the material is too expensive and it costs too much. So we need to determine which of those was the cause for the difference. So essentially the way standard cost performance or variance report works is we begin by preparing a standard cost performance report. So we compare the actual experience with our expectations as determined by the standard costs. Then we analyze the variances from those standard costs and identify exceptions that we want to manage. So identify questions that we need to ask or need to understand. Why is it that you were so far over on your direct materials budget? We need to ask the appropriate level of management, or they expect the appropriate manager, and then they can look into it and see if they can figure out exactly why the variance occurred. You may actually investigate variances which are under expectations substantially as well, because it could just mean that your expectations are incorrect. So the explanations aren't for the purpose of identifying who to blame for the error. The explanations are to help you do a better job of developing expectations and of managing your costs carefully in the future. So that's the corrective actions part here. And then we conduct the next period's operations and we do it all again. So each period would have a standard cost performance report, and we would do a thorough variance analysis in each case. So the first question you may want to ask is, how do we actually set these standard costs? Well, there are a number of different kinds of expertise which are required in determining standard costs. Accountants are good at measuring costs, so we can calculate historical costs for particular units of production, so cost per kilogram of material or cost per hour of direct labor. And so the accountants would definitely be involved in the job. Engineers would be involved in determining what the most efficient way of producing something would be. And so if they determine that a particular level of skill would be required with with a capital-intensive production process, a different level of skill would be required for a labor-intensive process. Then you can actually make decisions on the basis of which of those is more efficient overall, and engineers would help you with that. Purchasing agents are the ones who are responsible for actually determining what an appropriate price would be for a material, and so they would be involved in determining what the cost side of the standard cost would be. Production managers are experienced in terms of the volume of activity, or the labor hours that are used to produce different products, and so they would be able to determine the quantity side of the direct labor. So a number of different kinds of skills and a number of different kinds of expertise is required for setting standard costs. Now you could set ideal standards, and ideal standards are what, if everything goes perfectly, what would you expect the standard cost to be. So it requires your employees to be perfectly efficient, and it requires your purchasing manager to be perfectly able to identify the minimum cost for very high quality merchandise. That's probably not practical, given that we're human beings, and to err is human, as the saying goes. So generally, standard costs should be set in terms of practical standards, which are challenging to achieve, but not unattainable. So they can be done, but they require you to be relatively efficient. So you can't slack off. You can't sort of build in and slack into these numbers and expect your employees to meet the higher standards. So you would set your practical standards at a reasonable level for a normal employee to meet, and so it's maybe a bit of a stretch, but not a huge stretch. Not impossible. There are motivational issues that go with impossible standards. So, setting direct material standards, there's a standard price per unit, and of course we've talked in 253, the previous financial accounting course, about all of the costs that go into inventory, and so all of those inventory costs for raw materials would be included in the inventory cost. The standard price per unit for the material which is used in the production process. The standard quantity per unit might be determined by the engineers we talked about, but essentially there would be an expectation of the amount of the direct material that would be used in a particular product, and as we said, it's a practical standard, so there would be an allowance made for things which normally happen. If you are stamping your metal into particular shapes, then unless you have a very, very efficient design, there are going to be pieces of the metal which are just discarded because they are stamped in different kinds of arrangements. So if you've ever seen a quilter working, my wife is a quilter, they don't use 100% of the material, even if they try, and so there's always an amount of waste which is consistent with the production process, and so that would be built into the standard quantity per unit, and that standard quantity is essentially a reasonable amount of quantity per unit of production. Similarly, direct labor standards are set. The standard rate per hour is usually determined by a negotiated process between the employees and management. So it could be a union situation or it could be a non-union situation, but the labor rate would be determined by either agreed individual contract or an overall general contract. And so different skill levels and different seniority might have a different cost per hour, and part of the production manager's responsibility would be to assess the skills needed for different components of the production process and make sure that they allocate the right people. So the people who are just starting out would probably get the less difficult tasks, and the highly skilled, highly experienced employees would be the ones that would be engaged with the more difficult and more challenging tasks. The standard hours per unit, that may also be determined by an engineer. They're referring in the slide to time and motion studies, and time and motion studies are an analysis of the most efficient way of doing particular labor functions. And so you would identify what the appropriate way of doing something is with less wasteful activity. You don't necessarily try to require a human being to act in the same way that a robot would in following the programmed instructions, but you should expect them to be reasonably efficient. And so as part of your training, you would need to establish the minimum time and motion required to do particular activities, and you would need to train your employees in doing that. Variable overhead, the price of variable overhead is determined using the predetermined overhead rate, which we talked about a long time ago in the job costing chapter, which I believe was 4 or 5. And the quantity standards is the basis for the allocation. So in general, variable overhead standards are mostly price differentials, because of the price differential would be the over and under applied overhead that we talked about in that previous chapter. Alright, so here we have a standard cost card, and the standard cost card tells us what it should cost us to manufacture 1 unit of some product. So it specifies the quantity of materials and the quantity of labor and the relative quantity of variable manufacturing overhead. So in this case, it's based on direct labor hours because it's the same number of hours as direct labor. We see there's also a standard price per pound of material, price per hour of direct labor, and a price per hour for variable manufacturing overhead. And so we simply multiply the two columns to get the standard cost. So there's a price component and a cost component. So these are the standard quantities, the standard price. We're going to be comparing those to the actual quantity and the actual price as part of the variance analysis later. So why do we actually separate price and quantity? Well, because of the different person who's responsible. So we want to be sure that we're doing proper responsibility accounting, and so we're assessing the results and asking for explanations from the responsible manager. So the purchasing manager's job is to make sure that they purchase raw materials at a specified quality level and minimize the cost. The production manager is responsible for using the raw materials by assigning direct labor to particular functions. And so there are different functions, and different managers should be held responsible. Of course, there are interactions between the two. If the purchasing manager buys shoddy materials, then the production manager is not going to be as efficient, because some of the labor time will be spent culling the substandard materials, and there will be more waste and more spoilage as a result of those substandard materials. So therefore, that's one of the reasons why the purchasing manager has a minimum quality standard, is because that minimum quality is required to maximize the efficiency of the production manager's work. Standards versus budgets. What's the difference between a standard and a budget? A budget is the total amount that you expect to spend, and standard is at the unit level. So the budget doesn't actually deal with variances for particular processes, whereas the standard cost and variance analysis that we're going to talk about today would be at the detailed level of the volume of materials purchased and the price paid for materials specifically. So it's a much more granular measure, as the economists like to say. Standards may be used in preparing budgets, so if you're predicting what the cost is going to be, a good source of an estimate of the cost would be the standard cost for the production process. So what do we do with variance analysis? Well, we look at a price variance and a quantity variance. So we set the standards for price and the standards for quantity separately. We also analyze them in separate calculations. So the price variance looks at the difference between the actual price and the standard price applied to the standard quantity of materials. So we take the difference in price times the standard quantity. The quantity variance looks at the difference between the actual quantity and the standard quantity based on the standard price. So we'll see how those formulas actually work out in a bit, but we analyze the price variance separate from the quantity variance, and the total difference between the actual cost and the standard cost would be analyzed in terms of these two variances. The price variance plus the quantity variance would be the total variance. For different kinds of costs, we use different terminology. So we don't generally talk about the price of labor, although the economists kind of use that language, but we call it a labor rate, so it's a pay rate. And for variable overhead, we call it a spending variance. For materials, we pay a price for the materials, so a price variance definitely would apply there. Materials quantity variance is the materials. There's no measure of efficiency being. We don't have any measure of efficiency in mind when we think of materials quantity. It just kind of sits there, right? It's not inefficient or efficient, but the amount of the materials purchased and used in production of an average unit of production is something we're interested in. So if you use too much, it's not really because the materials were inefficient. It may be because either labor or variable overhead were inefficient. So we use a slightly different terminology for materials than as compared to labor and volume. Variable overhead and labor are referred to as efficiency variances, and essentially a variable overhead efficiency is essentially a labor efficiency variance, just multiplied by the variable overhead predetermined rate. So the variable overhead efficiency variance isn't really a measure on its own. A general model is shown here. So we have actual quantity times actual price, and of course that's the actual amount because it's the quantity we actually bought times the price we actually paid. So that's the actual number, so that's the check we wrote. The actual quantity times the standard price asks the question, well, if we bought that quantity for the price that we should have paid, the difference between actual quantity times actual price and actual quantity times standard price identifies the effect of the difference in price on the total price paid. So the difference in price is called the price variance. The other, on the right hand side of the table, we see the standard quantity times the standard price, and we're comparing that to the actual quantity times the standard price. So we're assuming we paid the standard price for our materials, and we're comparing the actual quantity, and that the difference in quantity multiplied by the standard price gives us a measure of the quantity variance. The total of the price variance and the quantity variance is the total variance or spending variance for materials. Okay. So we often summarize the effect of these measures with the acronyms. So AQ stands for actual quantity, AP actual price, SP standard price, SQ standard quantity, and of course we substitute hours in for the labor amounts and rates instead of prices. But in general, the formulaic approach is as shown above. So if AQ times AP minus AQ times SP is the price variance, you can see that you can gather the AQ outside and just take AQ times the difference between the actual price and the standard price. The way this formula is actually set up with the standard applied, the standard price applied to the actual quantity, subtracted from the actual quantity times the actual price. The way it sets up is that if you pay more, you actually get a positive number. So it's one of my quibbles with management accounting textbooks. If you set up the equation in the other direction, so that you're subtracting the actual price from the standard price, a negative number actually would indicate an unfavorable variance. So just be aware of that the variance isn't indicated by the sign. You actually have to go through the analysis of which is more expensive. If the actual is more expensive than the standard, then that's a bad thing. That's an unfavorable variance. So be careful with that. This is an example of it. This is an illustration taken from your textbook, so you'll see that there. The price variance is the difference between the actual quantity times the actual price minus the actual quantity times the standard price. Now it's easy to say what one is. It's the actual amount spent. It's easy to say what column 3 is. It's the standard cost for a unit. It's really hard to describe the middle number. So it would be the actual quantity applied at the standard price, or the standard price applied to the actual quantity, if you like. There's no really short form of identifying the middle column. You would think somebody would be able to come up with a good label for that. Okay, so here we have our first example. We have material variances that we're going to calculate based on a company called Glacier Peak Outfitters. You may have a particular brand in mind when you see that term, but of course we can't use that actual brand. So Glacier Peak Outfitters makes mountain parkas, and they use fiberfill. The standard cost is 1 kilogram of fiberfill per parka at $5 per kilogram. And so last month we used 210, or actually we purchased 210 kilograms of fiberfill and used that to make 2,000 parkas. The material cost a total of 1,029. So that's the actual cost. That's the actual quantity times the actual price. That's the check we wrote, 1,029. So we can use this information to determine the variance analysis. So we have 1,029 as the actual quantity times the actual price. We know that the actual quantity was 210 kilograms. So from that we can determine that the actual price was $4.90 per kilogram. And we often have to back our way into determining what the actual price is. The actual quantity being 210 kilograms, the standard price is $5 per kilogram. Those 210 kilograms should have cost us $1,050. We paid $1,029, which means we paid a little bit less than we expected to, and that's a $21 favorable variance because we spent less than we expected. The quantity variance, the 210 kilograms that we purchased, were supposed to cost us $5 per kilogram, and the standard quantity for producing 2,000 parkas is only 200 kilograms. So if we bounce back up just a second, 210 kilograms were used in 2,000 parkas. It's supposed to be 0.1 kilogram per parka, so 2,000 parkas times 0.1 kilograms works out to 200 kilograms. So the standard cost for the parka, for the number of parkas we actually produced, is 200 kilograms of fiberfill. So 200 kilograms at the standard price should have cost us $1,000. This isn't such good news because it means that we used a higher quantity than standard to produce these parkas. So it's a $50 unfavorable variance. Now if we compare the actual price to the standard, the actual quantity times the actual price, the actual amount paid of $1,029, it's higher than the $1,000 standard cost for 2,000 parkas, and overall it's a $29 unfavorable spending variance. Now we could tell a little story about this. We could see that the favorable price might have been for substandard material, and because it's substandard material, we used more kilograms than we expected to because some of the material was unusable or that was more difficult to use. So therefore, there is an interaction between the two kinds of variances. All right. So we can also apply an equation to do these calculations as well. We take the actual quantity times the difference in prices. That gives us the $21 favorable result. So in this case, it actually would end up being a negative value because $5 is subtracted from $4.90 to give us a negative number. But a negative number, given the way the formula is written, results in a favorable variance. So you need to analyze the variance to determine whether or not it's consistent with the sign. And the way these formulas are written, it isn't consistent with the sign. So $21 favorable price variance, $50 unfavorable quantity variance. the $50 unfavorable quantity variance comes out as a positive number. The 21 is actually a negative number. So we need to ask a question. The production manager was responsible for the material quantity variance. So we may ask the production manager why the quantity variance was unfavorable. Now, the standard price is applied to both quantities because the production manager isn't being held responsible for the purchasing manager's price performance, and so it's all at the standard price. But we can see, as I mentioned, if there's a cross correlation between the two. If the purchasing manager purchases poor material, then we would expect production to be less efficient. So it could be that the material quantity variance was due to a material price favorable variance. On the other hand, from the purchasing manager's perspective, if the production manager didn't do a good job of scheduling, and so there were rush orders would tend to be done more quickly, and you would expect more waste in that situation. So you need to ask the question of both the purchasing manager and the production manager exactly why the variances were experienced. And it's once again, it's not a blame shifting process. It's supposed to be a way of determining whether our expectations were reasonable and whether or not we're actually producing our goods and services efficiently. So here's a quick check for you. Hansen Inc. has the following direct materials standard for one zippy. I'm not sure what a zippy is. Doesn't really matter. But this is what it takes to make a zippy. 1.5 pounds of direct material at $4 per pound. Last week, 1,700 pounds of material were purchased, and we used those to make 1,000 zippies. Well, that's a little bit more than we expect, right? Because it's 1.5 pounds per zippy, and it's 1,000 zippies. That should be 1,500 pounds. So that's one thing that we can identify. The material cost a total of $6,630. So the question you're being asked, which we'll get here in a second, was the material price variance one of these four figures? The material price variance. So how do you calculate the material price variance? Well, the material price variance is the difference between the $4 per pound that we paid, the $4 per pound, which is the standard cost, and $6,630, which we paid for 1,700 pounds of material. So if we take 6630, this would be where in class I would ask you to calculate the ratio, or the dollars per pound here. So we've got 6,630 total dollars, and that was paid for 1,700 units of material. That's actually a price per pound of $3.90. Cheap compared to the $4 per pound standard cost, or standard price. So we're asking about the material price variance. We take the difference in prices and multiply by the actual quantity of material. So we've got $3.90 is the actual price. We subtract $4 per pound and multiply by the actual quantity of materials, which is 1,700. So that's $170, and we paid less than expectation. So that would presumably be 170 favorable. And let's see, that's what turns out to be the correct answer. The material quantity variance. The material quantity variance is the standard price applied to the difference in quantities. So once again, let's bounce back up here. We use 1,700 pounds of material, and 1,700 pounds of material is the actual amount, but the standard amount is 1.5 times 1,000 zippies. So we want the result to be in pounds because we pay per pound. 1,700 pounds compared to 1,500 pounds is a difference of 200 pounds. We apply that based on the $4 per pound standard cost. It's an $800 variance, and the variance is unfavorable because we took more pounds of material than we expected to take. So this quick check, we have 800 and it's unfavorable. The calculation is done as you see here. So if we add up the information from our quick check example, the actual price we paid was $6,630 in order to make 1,000 zippies, whatever a zippy might be. It should cost us $6,000. Part of that was due to using too much quantity, 1,700 pounds versus 1,500, but we saved some money on the price variance side. So the overall difference, the actual versus the standard, is $630, and that's an unfavorable variance because we paid more than we expected to pay. I think we probably should stop at that point. We had a 22-minute video for the in-class problem, 9-25, and here we have 31 minutes so far for the PowerPoint slides. We'll pick up from slide number 33 on Monday, assuming that I'm back in class. So have a good weekend, everybody, and thanks for listening.